Hello, I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley.
And I'm her daughter, Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi and I want to welcome you to Open to Hope Conversations, the podcast.
We believe that the greatest gift you can give yourself after a loss is hope, using this moment to connect with others who have not only survived but thrived.
So let's get started. Welcome to the Open to Hope show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi. We've got a great show today, but before we get going, I wanted to mention to people that our book, Open to Love, The Secrets of Senior Dating, is on Amazon now, and it was written by Dr. Frank Powers, my fiance, and me. And the book's filled with tips and tools for those of you, like me, who are looking for companionship as an antidote to loneliness. That's the number one mental health issue for seniors right now. And all proceeds for the book go to the Open to Hope Foundation with the mission of helping people find hope after loss. Well, Heidi, let's get going for our show today, because we are going to be talking about regulating yourself after a loss. And our guest has got some wonderful thoughts and ideas about taking care of yourself after you've had a loss. Would you like to introduce her, Heidi?
I would be honored to, Mom. Our guest today is a leader in the field of grief and loss all over the world. Her name is Meghan Riordan Jarvis. She is a clinical psychotherapist, author, podcast host, and two-time TEDx speaker. She is the founder of MRJ Consulting. She has a podcast called Grief is My Side Hustle, and she has written a groundbreaking memoir called The End of the Hour. She is no stranger to grief and loss, Mom, as both of her parents died in close succession to each other. So welcome to our podcast, Meghan.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
It kind of reminds me of my story, because my son died 40 years ago in an automobile accident, and I was an expert in grief and loss at the time, and at the University of Rochester. And I know you kind of have a similar thing as that, right?
Yeah. So I had a death in my childhood when I was 9. A teenager drowned while I was at a beach. I grew up in a really small town, and he was beloved by the whole town. And it was just a seminal lifetime event that no one ever spoke about until I was in my early 20s, and I went into therapy for a breakup. Sad, terrible thing has happened. And the therapist there at the end of that session said, "Hey, just, curious, did anything bad ever happen in your childhood? Was there a trauma?" And I answered no, because I had never spoken about it. It had never been validated as a significant event. Well, fast forward that process of sort of unearthing how trauma defines who you become, that you become hypervigilant and that you feel other. All of those things that we know in the world of grief and loss happen to grievers. When they happen to children and you're not supported, they become not an event, but something that the child is. I am someone who is overly afraid. I am someone who is different than others. And I just fell in love with the idea that I could reconstruct the understanding of myself in the world. And so I became a therapist. I went back to school. I'd been working at a social policy organization. I went back to school and, did all the studying and jumped right in, took all the hard, intensive trainings about trauma, and worked with really complicated, difficult patients. I live in Washington, D.C., so there's no shortage of people who are, foreign service agents, people who work in defense contractors, people who've seen really hard things. So I had a very busy private practice. And I don't think I understood at the time that all of the training that I was doing was maybe intended not just to help my clients, but to act as a life preserver or some saran wrap between me and the rest of the world. And in 2016, he was diagnosed with small cell cancer, which is a death sentence. And then basically a year after his diagnosis, he died. And during that year, I understood how ill he was. He knew he was dying. And we had this year that was really like better than most of the rest, where we spent time with each other in a very softened way. And what I often talk about is sort of I participated in his death. And when he died, it was very sad, but it was not dysregulating from a trauma perspective. And I'll come back to that. It was just as we think of grief, it was hard and difficult, and it did not knock me off my life path, but it became something that I had to learn how to integrate into my life story. 2 years later, I was on vacation with my mom and my kids, and she had had an illness, which maybe now we understand may have been a bleeding ulcer. And she went to sleep and didn't wake up. And that was the absolute opposite experience. That was immediate trauma, immediate understanding. And I had a lot of metacognition as a clinician who's helped people, with ruminations. I had this really mystical experience that makes me uncomfortable to talk about, because I just wish that I didn't have to face this complicated, non-scientific thing. I knew she had been ill. She had been ill for a while. I was driving. I was about an hour away from her house, and I had the sensation of water breaking in my stomach. And then I had a very clear thought, which has happened to me a few times in my life, which is she is dead, is what the word said. And my husband was back at the house, and so I called him and said, I think she's dead. And he was the one who found her. I didn't find her, but I was alone in a minivan full of children.
Right.
An hour from my mother's house, in that sort of urgent, panicked, disoriented, confused. I was in a parking lot outside of Boston. The building was like a broken down Dairy Princess. It wasn't even a Dairy Queen. And my minivan was idling. Like, I got out of the car. My husband insisted, even though I had told him that she died, he wanted me to pull over so that he could tell me she had died.
Oh my goodness.
And I have 5 brothers and sisters, so I called them all in that moment, even though in that moment I was like, I'm a trauma therapist. They're going to remember this for the rest of their lives. Like, what do I do to make this not terrible for them?
Yeah, you move into your therapy mode to control yourself.
Right in that moment, right in that moment, I sort of abandon the daughter who is
overcompensate immediately.
Yeah. And I become sort of a caretaker. And then I got really ill with that. I got really ill. One of the first things I thought when I learned that she died, because I'd been with her, was that it was my fault. So I just had like this ringing, like, oh my God, it's my fault. Like, if I had just done. And I had ruminations. And then very quickly, that central nervous system dysregulation, which is what we really think of when we're talking about trauma. That's like at the root of trauma, is central nervous system dysregulation, meaning that your spinal cord all the way up into your brain, that is the circuitry that sends messages from your brain down into your body, and your body back up to the brain in the vagus nerve, that it's almost like it has a rash. It's almost like it's overstimulated in a way that skews the messaging and also immediately impacts your body, because we have these 12 systems in our body, our digestive tract, our reproductive tract, our endocrine, all these systems that allow us to live a healthy life. And when your brain goes into that fight, flight, and freeze response, in order to do that, it also cuts off some of the regular messaging that would typically happen. And then you get this dysregulation cycle. So the messages that your digestive tract need to get in order to function properly, it's like that mail is not going into that mailbox.
What you're saying right now is so important, because one of the things that people tend to say is that everybody grieves differently. Well, there are certain responses that does happen. I mean, that normalizes it.
Yes.
Say that everybody grieves differently, you feel out of control. There are some things that happen to the body.
Absolutely. I mean, what I often talk about is, also everyone goes through puberty differently, but we teach a puberty class. Not everybody has their voice drop or that they get acne, but when kids are like 11, before they're even into that stage, we sit them down and we say, listen, your body is about to go through something, and we don't want you to be afraid. And we want you to know not only what's normal, but when to ask people for help, right? When to turn to someone. So you've really nailed it, which is, we do this thing about sort of turning away from grief, and we leave grievers to reinvent the wheel, because we say it's
everybody grieves differently.
Everybody grieves differently, except that we all grieve with our bodies.
Yeah.
That's how we're all grieving. So yes, it's totally true. My team and I have something called the mentor method, the grief mentor method, which is it's 6 core concepts that we have heard for the past 25 years from grievers, help them move through grief. So,
Right.
Interesting.
can I teach you how to grieve? No. Can I give you a concept of, can I give you just a series of tenets of what people say they need to address in order to integrate loss? Of course I can, because I've been in the field for 25 years doing this. However, I can also turn to neuroscience and bioscience, and I can talk to those folks about, well, what is typical in grief and loss? We either eat too much or we can't eat at all. Can you tell me why that might happen? And guess what? They can. Of course they can. Or I can't sleep. Can you tell me why that would happen? And when you sit and talk to a neuroscience, they say, sure, your hippocampus or your hypothalamus, they're not getting the typical messages that they need to get. And those are deep inside the brain. And then what do we do about it?
What happened to you and how did you deal with all these nervous system things?
It's such a great question, and really it's the crux of the reason why I decided to take the book from something that I was writing as blog posts and turn it into something that other people could read, because who better to learn from than someone who shouldn't have completely fallen apart, right? It's such an important message. If it's possible to have all the education prevent you from needing grief support, then I would have been the person who would have breezed through my mother's death. But that's not what happened. What happened was I had a rumination first. So a rumination is a circular thought. It's like walking around a track. You're not going to see any new buildings. You're not going to see any new bushes. You're just going to keep passing the same pieces. Ruminations are different than worry. Worry, if you worry about something, you will actually hopefully be productive in that worry. If I worry I need to replace my tires, then eventually I'm going to replace the tires on my car. Ruminations can make you very sick. And I immediately had a thought, which was, it's my fault she died. And then I had all the biophysical sort of shutdown and closure that I can say this to you. I have a lot of respect and admiration and love for my body for doing that, because it wasn't trying to ruin my life. It understood that the trauma of what had just happened was going to be so overwhelming for me. It wanted to keep me like curled up into a ball.
Mm-hmm.
But what that meant was, in a primary way, I really, honest to God, did not eat more than handfuls of food for about 2 months. And what was interesting about that is that did not cause me to lose weight. So when you talk to a medical doctor, they'll explain about cortisol levels and about stress and how you don't lose weight. So no one knew I was hiding it. And I was not sleeping. I was sleeping about 3 hours a night. And those were my 2 primary symptoms. The way it showed up with people was I was irritable all the time. Think about a tired baby and how fussy they are. I mean, I just hated people. And I still could take a shower and still put a sweater on. So I looked kind of normal. So people liked to talk to me like I was normal. And then I just hated them even more for that.
So how did you get out of this?
Yeah, that's
Well, so I did what I know to do. And this is also part of the reason that I wrote the book, is that, when I'm using the grief mentor method, that is intended for people who need support. I ended up needing treatment. So, I won't go into all of the like diagnostics and all of that because they're not relevant, but it is important to sort of say, like, there's a difference between the kind of grief that is part of our lives and is not really a mental health problem, and then the kind that needs treatment because it has become a mental.
And Meghan, that's why it's important not just to always say everyone grieves differently. That's fine.
Yes.
But when, like you're saying, when am I in a point in my life where I actually need help? I actually need to reach out to somebody like you, somebody like me, somebody that's professional. I can't do it on my own. It's too much.
Right. And so my symptoms were getting worse. So that was my threshold. When people say, how do you know? What I say is like, look, if you're 3 months into your grief and loss process and you're sleeping less and you're eating less and you're crying more and you have no hope and you can't see a way forward that would ever, you should just go see a clinician. You don't have to know whether or not you need treatment. The clinician will tell you. The same way that if you brought in your tennis elbow and said, I don't know if I need surgery, the doctor will decide.
But I like this.
right? Take that suffering there. And the treatments that I required are EMDR, so eye movement and desensitization and reprocessing. You can't do, it's like trying to tickle yourself. You can't really do EMDR effectively on your own. You could, there are elements to bilateral stimulation that you can, but you can't really do it to yourself. And you know, really at its core, what I really needed was to balance out my central nervous system so that I could sleep. I really needed to be able to sleep. Everything restorative that happens in the body happens primarily in
Well, and you're making another point. Just because you're a professional or know a lot about grief and loss doesn't mean that you can control what's happening. You still might need to
yes.
get help from somebody else.
Yes,
I have
unfortunately.
to say,
Yeah.
when my son died, I taught at the University of Rochester, and I was a clinical nurse specialist. And the one thing that I remember saying was, I needed to take sleeping pills.
Yeah.
I really
Yeah.
did. I'm not a person who takes pills.
Yeah.
But I absolutely had
You
to get
knew.
some sleep.
Yeah. I couldn't get any sleep.
And
So what I ended up doing, you know, when people read the book, one question that I get all the time is sort of like, you know, what was the thing that really, no, being a grief and loss specialist, what was the thing that helped you the most? And the thing that helped me the most was knowing I needed treatment. Most clients that come see me have been suffering with their symptoms for a year, which is pretty brutal. And B, knowing where to get the treatment. So
Yeah.
at like vast expense, my family and I ended up having to borrow money to do it because this is the world that we live in. I checked myself into the same inpatient facility where I send my clients, and I had 21 days of inpatient, you know, a whole team of people. That was how unwell I was. And that was for 21 days. I mean, I wouldn't tell you that I was well when I came out after 21 days. I was just better than I had been when I went in. I was able to sleep a little bit, and they did use medication to help with that. There are some really wonderful medications that can help sort of when you're having traumatic dreams, they can help impact those traumatic dreams. Also, I was you know, I had nutrition brought back into my system. So I was given, much like people with eating disorders, you know, this is how much we want you to eat. We don't care if you eat other things. These are the things that have micronutrients that your body needs in order to do the regeneration. And that was a real, you know, food still is a struggle and sleep is still a struggle. And my mom died 4.5 years ago. So the central nervous system dysregulation that sort of entered my system on account of her death is something that I live with. The same way the PTSD of that rumination thought. I mean, I'm clear to tell people that I understand that it's not my fault that my mother died, but that doesn't mean that I don't regularly sometimes think that it is. That
Right.
thought lives inside me, and sometimes it gets the microphone. I know, but that doesn't mean that I don't sometimes feel.
And even if everybody's reassuring you that of course it's not your fault, that's ridiculous, that's absurd, it's not enough. You
No.
rationally understand all those arguments because you're giving them to yourself.
And ruminations don't really work that way. You know, the challenge with them, because they do come from, a rumination is like a sleight of hand. It's a look over here, and we will do this loop forever. And the reason this loop is forever is because what you have to do over here is harder. So come over here in this thought, it's your fault your mother died, and just blame yourself forever. Because what is the option? The option is learn how to live on the planet without your mother.
Right.
My system has no confidence that I can do that because I've never done it before. Blame myself for something? Yeah, I can do that.
It keeps her alive and close. How do I get help? How do I find somebody to help me? I don't feel like I need to go into an institution, but how do I find somebody? Can any therapist help me?
No, I mean, this is the trick. I have a book called Can Anyone Tell Me? Essential Questions About Grief and Loss. And it is a really warmly written book. It's got very funny chapters like, you know, can anyone tell me why I have brain fog? Can anyone tell me why I think that butterfly is my mom? Can anyone tell me why smart people say such stupid stuff? There is one chapter in there that's like, can anyone tell me why I have to go see a trauma-informed therapist? And this is because there are many different modalities for treating all the things that people struggle with. But when you have trauma inside your system, so something bad happens and your system has made meaning of it, and the meaning is showing up in symptoms like you're not sleeping and you're not eating and you have these chaotic thinking, you need someone who knows how to work with the body because those beliefs are held inside the body. And so in the book, I outline these are people who do EMDR, they do sensory motor psychotherapy, they use IFS. They're people who are very well trained in modalities that are designed not to be what we call top level, which are the thinking kind, but sort of bottom up. We're going to start with the body and we're going to move energy through the body. So I love pastoral counselors, therapists, coaches, grief coaches, all of right up until you have someone who has symptoms that are totally disrupting their ability to do their normal life. They're no longer on a normal life path at all. And those symptoms are not getting better. Then you need to see somebody who has extensive training and can provide treatment.
All right. Well, tell us about where we find you and your books. And I know you're doing a writing workshop called Grief Mates. Is that right?
Yes. So Grief Mates is a rolling workshop. You can find it at my website, which is just my name, Meghan Riordan Jarvis. If it's easier, because my name spelling is tricky, Google Grief is My Side Hustle, which is the name of my podcast, and it will loop you to my website. I'm really active on Instagram, and my handle is my name. You can find me on LinkedIn. And yeah, the Grief Mates is free. It's writing prompts that come out once a week. They come out on Mondays. There's a new one today. And there's lots of ways. I do a lot of corporate work. I see a few clients. I do a lot of book club things right now. And supervision. So I'm pretty easy to get in touch with, and I have a small team, and they check the inbox every day. So if you're trying to find me, we'll respond.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. You're an amazing person, and you're also on the panel for parent loss. If they go to Open to Hope for our conference that we have.
Right. That was such a great panel.
Yes, Meghan, thank you so much. And if people want to know more about your riveting story, which is unbelievable, please go and get Meghan's memoir, The End of the Hour. Please go and get it and read how she took this journey out of the darkness and back into the light. I mean, it's very powerful. Meghan, thank you so much for everything you're doing for the world. You are really a guiding light for so many.
Thank you both. I say the same thing. What you all do, I mean, just the name, Open to Hope. Hope is what we need in these really hard days when we're trying to navigate grief, and you offer us so much. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for joining us on this show today. And Heidi and I always want to remind you that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and God bless.
I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley. You have been listening to Open to Hope, the podcast. You can follow Open to Hope on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To learn more, visit us at opentohope.com and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe.
I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley. Join us again next week for another Open to Hope conversation, where we invite you to lean on our hope until you find your own.